Continuing Chapter 4, Tammuz and Adonis, from Jessie L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance. While it is only of comparatively recent date that information as to the exact character of the worship directed to Tammuz has been available, and the material we at present possess is but fragmentary in character. The corresponding cult of the Phoenician Greek aspect of divinity we know as Adonis has, for some years, been the subject of scholarly research. Aleph, Daleth, Noon, Yud. So it definitely made its way into the biblical mythology. Not only have the details of the ritual been examined and discussed, and their surviving artistic evidence described and illustrated, but from the anthropological side, attention has been forcibly directed to its importance as a factor in the elucidation of certain widespread folk beliefs and practices. The most complete inquiry into the nature of the alleged god is to be found in Baudisin, Adonis, and Esmun. For the details of the cult, Fernal, Cults of the Greek States, Volume 2, Belay Adonis, Analyst du, Musi Golmet. For the folklore evidence, Menhart, Wald und Feld Cult, Fraser, the Golden Bough, and Adonis, Attis, Osiris. These remarks apply also to the kindred cult of Attis, which, as we shall see later, forms an important link in our chain of evidence. The two cults are practically identical, and scholars are frequently at a loss to which group surviving fragments of the ritual should be assigned. We now know that worship of Adonis, which enjoyed among the Greeks a popularity extending to our own day, was originally of Phoenician origin, its principal centers being the cities of Byblos and Africa. And I would say it goes up to Göbekli Tepe 10,000 years before, but from Phoenicia, it spread to the Greek islands, the earliest evidence of the worship being found in Cyprus, and from thence to the mainland, where it established itself firmly. The records of the cult go back to 700 BCE, but it might quite be possibly of a much earlier date. Mr. Langdon suggests that the worship of the entity we know as Adonis may, under another name, reach back to an antiquity equal with that which we can now ascribe to the cult of Tammuz. In its fully evolved classical form, the cult of Adonis offers, as it were, a halfway house between the fragmentary relics of Aryan and Babylonian antiquity and the wealth of medieval and modern survivals, to which this ingenuity and patience of contemporary scholars have directed our attention. We all know the mythological tale, popularly attached to the name of Adonis, that he was a fair youth, beloved of Aphrodite, who, wounded in his thigh by a wild boar, died of his wound. The so-called goddess, in despair at his death, by her prayers, won from Zeus, which Zeus in particular you can think of in a non-personified way, the boon that Adonis be allowed to return to earth for a portion of the year, and henceforward the youthful entity divides his time between the demoness of Hades, Persephone, and Aphrodite, but the importance assumed by the story, the elaborate ceremonial with which the death of Adonis was mourned, and his restoration to life vetted the date and character of the celebrations, all leave no doubt that the personage with whom we are dealing with was no mere favorite of who was considered to be a goddess, but one with whose life and well-being the ordinary processes of nature, whether animal or vegetable, were closely and intimately concerned. In fact, the central figure of these rites, by whatever name he may be called, is the somewhat elusive and important entity who represents in anthropomorphic form the principle of animate nature, upon whose preservation and impaired energies the life of man directly and indirectly depends. In this connection, note the extremely instructive remarks of Miss Harris in the chapter on Heracles in the work referred to above. She points out that Eneautos Daemon never becomes entirely an Olympian, but always retains traces of his earth origin. This principle is particularly well illustrated by Adonis, who, though admitted to Olympus as the lover of Aphrodite, is yet by his very nature forced to return to the earth and descend to the realm of Persephone. This agrees well with the conclusion reached by Baudissin in his Adonis und Esmun, page 71, that Adonis belongs to einer Klasse von Wesen Saher unbestimmter Art, die wohl über den Menschen aber unter den großen Göttern stehen. Okay, I'm not too good at saying German, but before proceeding to the examination of these rites, there is one point to which I have alluded earlier in another connection, upon which our minds must be quite clear, i.e., the nature of the inquiry suffered. Writers upon the subject are of one accord in considering the useful account to be but a euphemistic veiling of the truth, while the close relation between the stories of Adonis and Attis and the practices associated with the cult place beyond any shadow of a doubt the fact that the true reason for this universal mourning was the cessation or suspension by injury or death of the reproductive energy of the so-called God, upon whose virile activity vegetable life directly and human life indirectly depended. If Baudissin be correct, and the introduction of abhors a later addition to the story, it would seem to indicate that the intrusion of a phallic element into ritual, which at first, like that of Tammuz, dealt merely with the death of the entity, Attis' form, on the contrary, appears to have been phallic from the first. What we have need to seize and to insist upon is the overpowering influence which the sense of life, the need for life, the essential sanctity of the life-giving faculty exercised upon so-called primitive religions. Belay puts this well when he says, in fact, the whole religious cycle of the Oriental peoples of antiquity rests on the conception of physical life, considered in its origin and its action, and in the dual principle which animates it. Professor von Schroeder says even more precisely and emphatically, in the ancient Aryan in the ancient Aryan religion, everything's aimed at the affirmation of life. This phallus can be considered its dominant symbol. And in spite of the strong opposition is this cult mentioned in the Indian literature beginning with the Rig Veda and ripening to fruition in the Upanishads in spite of the rise of Buddhism with its opposing dictum of renunciation. The life cult asserted its essential vitality against all opposition under the modified forms represents the popular religion of India to this day. And the Arthurian legends have certainly brought back a life-affirming, personal heroics sort of spirit that through vicariousness can be lost, and the idea of the god of this world and age being the evil one. But they had to insert the mass and stuff like this in the middle of the Arthurian tales to be allowed to say it. Each and all of the ritual dramas reconstructed in the pages of Mysterium and Mimas bear more or less distinctly the stamp of their fertility origin, while outside India, the pages of Fraser and Menhart and numerous other writers on folklore and ethnology record the widespread and persistent survival of these rites and their successful defiance of the spread of civilization. Certain cults acted like they were the civilized one and they brought civilization, and it may be well to explain the exact meaning attached to these terms by the author. In Professor von Schroeder's view, mysterium may be held to connote a drama in which the so-called gods themselves are actors. Mimas, on the contrary, is the term applied to a drama which treats the doings of mortals. Sorry, I'm having some pains here. It is to this special group of belief and practice that Adonis, and more especially its Phrygian counterpart, the Attis worship, belong, and even when transplanted to the more restrained and cultured environment of the Greek mainland, they still retain their primitive character. Farnell, in his Cults of the Greek States, refers to the worship of Adonis as a ritual that the more austere state religion of Greece probably failed to purify. The saner minds, bred up in a religious atmosphere that was, on the whole, genial and temperate, revolved from the din of cymbals and drums, the meaningless ecstasies of sorrow and joy that marked the new religion. All these things are definitely full of meaning, not just effect. There'd be particular patterns and stuff that would be played, certain frequencies that would be implemented in the instruments. And some areas were more refined with this than others. It is, I submit, indispensable for the purposes of our investigation that the essential character and significance of the cults with which we are dealing should not be evaded or ignored, but faced frankly, admitted, and held in mind during the progress of our inquiry. Having now determined the general character of the ritual, what were the specific details? The date of the feast seems to have varied in different countries. Thus, in Greece, it was celebrated in the spring, the moment of the birth of vegetation according to St. Jerome. In Palestine, the celebration fell in June, when plant life was at its first full luxuriance. In Cyprus, at the annual equinox, the beginning of the year in the Syro-Macedonian calendar, the death of Adonis falling on the 23rd of September. That was actually my day that I figured out that I had a soul, September 23rd, 2000. I believed that I was a spiritual entity operating a body, and I'd die, and I'd still be it. I wouldn't be stuck to this body, but I experienced it at that point, and then I became of a non-vicarious sort of faith. His resurrection on the 1st of October, the beginning of a new year, this would seem to indicate that here Adonis was considered, as Malley suggests, less as an entity of vegetation than as the superior and nameless Lord of Life, Adonis, Syriac Adon, Lord. Well, Tetragrammaton, you had a wow in the middle of it. But later, in Hebrew, you don't have a wow in the middle of it. But in Aramea, you had a wow. So, Aduni, under whose protection the year is placed, he is an Autas Daemon. Much of the uncertainty as to date is doubtlessly due to the reflective influence of other forms of the cult. The Tammuz celebrations were held from June the 20th to July the 20th, when the dog star Sirius was in the ascendant, and vegetation failed beneath the heat of the summer sun. In other, more temperate climates, the date would fall later. In the same way as the dates varied, so also did the order of the ritual. Generally speaking, the elaborate ceremonies of mourning for the dead entity and committing his eulogy to the waves preceded the joyous celebration of his resurrection. But in Alexandria, the sequence was otherwise. The feast began with the solemn and joyous celebration of the nuptials of Adonis and Aphrodite, at the conclusion of which a head of papyrus representing the entity was, with every show of mourning, committed to the waves and borne within 7 days by a current, always to be counted upon at that season of the year, to Byblos, where it was received and welcomed with popular rejoicing. The duration of the feast varied from 2 days, as at Alexandria, to 7 or 8. Connected with the longer period of the feast were the so-called Gardens of Adonis baskets, or pans, planted with quick-growing seeds, which speedily come to fruition, and as speedily wither. In the modern survivals of the cult, 3 days form the general term for the flowering of these gardens. Where, however, the cult was an offshoot of a Tammuz original, as might be the case through immigration, the tendency would be to retain the original date. In the cyclical monotony of the Autas Daemon, it matters little whether death follows resurrection or resurrection death. And the case is similar between Tammuz and Ezekiel in some other ways. The most notable feature of the ritual was the prominence assigned to women. It is the women who would weep for him and accompany him to his tomb. They sob wildly all night. This is as their God, more than any other, and they alone wish to lament his death and sing of his resurrection. Thus, in the 10th century, the festival received the Arabic name of Al-Mugat, or the Festival of the Weeping Women. One very curious practice during these celebrations was that of cutting off the hair in honor of the entity. Women who hesitated to make this sacrifice must offer themselves to strangers, either in the temple or on the marketplace. The gold received was the price of their favors being offered to the demoness. This obligation only lasted for 1 day. It was also customary for the priest of Adonis to mutilate themselves in imitation of the entity, a distinct proof, if one were needed, of the traditional cause of his death. Turning from a consideration of the Adonis ritual, its details and significance, to an examination of the Grail romances, we find that their Missa en scene provides a striking series of parallels with the classical celebrations, parallels which, instead of vanishing as parallels, have occasionally an awkward habit of doing before closer investigation rather gain in force the more closely they are studied. Thus, the central figure is either a dead knight on a bier, as in the Gawain versions, or a wounded king on a litter. When wounded, the injury corresponds with that suffered by Adonis and Attis. Manhart suggests that the women represent so-called goddesses and the stranger, Adonis. Closely connected with the wounding of the king is the destruction which has fallen on the land, which will be removed when the king is healed. The version of Sana da Nasei is here of extreme interest. The position is stated with so much clearness and precision that the conclusion cannot be evaded. We are face to face with the dreaded calamity, which it was the aim of the Adonis ritual to avert, the temporary suspension of all the reproductive energies of nature, while the condition of the king is the cause of general and vociferous lamentation, a special feature never satisfactorily accounted for. It is the presence of a weeping woman, or several weeping women. Thus, in the interpolated visit of Gawain to the Grail Castle, found in the C group of Perceval manuscripts, the Grail bearer weeps piteously, as she does also in Dia Crone. In the version of the prose, Lancelot Gawain, during the night, sees 12 maidens come to the door of the chamber where the Grail is kept, kneel down and weep bitterly. In fact, behave precisely as did the classical mourners for Adonis. They sob wildly all night long, behavior for which the text, as it now stands, provides no shadow of explanation or excuse. Her use of this parallel has been, Jessie L. Weston's use of the parallel has been objected to the ground, on the ground that the prose Lancelot is a late text and therefore cannot be appealed to as evidence for original incidents. But the Lancelot in original form was held by so competent an authority as late M. Gaston Paris to have been one of the earliest, if not the earliest, of the French prose texts. The adventure in question of a Gawain adventure, we do not know whence it was derived, and may well have been included in an earlier version of the romance. Apart from the purely literary question, from the strictly critical point, the view of the adventure here is obviously out of place and entirely devoid of raison d'etre. If the origin of the Grail legend is really to be found in these cults, which are not a dead but living tradition, how truly living, the exclusively literary critic has little idea. We are surely entitled to draw attention to the obvious parallels, no matter what in which text they appear. I'm not engaged in reconstructing the original form of the Grail story, but endeavoring to ascertain the ultimate source, and it's ultimately justifiable to point out that, in effect, no matter what version we take, we find in that version points of contact